Hi everyone, my name is Carly. I'm a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do digital painting. In this video, I'll be showing you my digital painting process and how I made this pattern in Procreate and how I made it similar looking to my traditional ink work. So for starters, I'm blocking out the petals by drawing some ellipses in the general direction that the petals are going in. That gives me the framework to then build up the structure and the ruffles that are going to be all around each petal of this poppy flower. Once I have the general sketch done, I do a new layer so that I have a cleaner outline of this poppy flower. So for this whole piece, I just used the Mercury ink brush that's in the ink category section under brushes in Procreate. I find that when it's at a very small size, it often resembles how ballpoint ink looks. Ballpoint ink oftentimes gives you a softer gradient and allows you to do more realism drawing with softer gradients and blending. And I'm not necessarily cross-hatching here, I'm putting all the lines in the direction of the contours of the petal. I'm also starting the line where the darkest shadow is, putting a lot more pressure in that area. As you flick the line out, it's going to fade out and become lighter. So you can see where this petal overlaps the one behind it. There's a darker line there. I'm putting a lot more pressure there and flicking it up. In areas where there's going to be more light hitting it, but there's still somewhat of a shadow cast, like in these ruffles on top here, I'm using a lot lighter of a hand. So I will show you an example of my traditional ink work. I use a lot of ballpoint ink. I love the gradients and shading you can get with it. I also love the realism that it can create and the softness of it versus using something more of an inky pen like a micron that has more of a felt tip. I'm doing digital for this because this is going to be a drawing I'm going to use to create an ink looking pattern that I'm going to put on my Spoonflower account, and it's going to be a repeat pattern. So when I do artwork that's meant for that kind of a thing, I like doing digital because it allows me to either reuse assets, copy and paste them and alter them a bit, especially for repeat patterns. I like having same but different elements in the pattern, so it just gives me a lot more freedom than if I were to solely do traditional media for that type of outcome. But the problem is that a lot of digital work tends to lack that feeling and warmth and texture of traditional media, and it's really important to me that no matter what I use, I want my artwork to look consistent. So I'm using a brush and I'm using it manually. I'm not downloading a cross-hatching brush online. I'm doing this all manually because I find that this matches my traditional style and I want that consistency no matter what I'm using to create my artwork. For the sole purpose of creating a repeat pattern, I am drawing all of these poppy flowers individually on different layers so that I can rearrange them later on however I see it fits. So right now I have the opacity at full opacity on my brush. I'm using the Mercury brush, very small, like size 2 or something like that. I'll write here what the actual size is, but obviously it depends on what size you will use depending on the size of your canvas. I'm using it very small and I'm drawing as if I were just drawing on a piece of paper. And I think that method and using the same approach translates really well to making this look consistent with my traditional work. Now, since I just got done talking about how I make that translate and match my traditional work, let's get into how I actually draw, how I actually shade, and why. So depending on what it is specifically that I am drawing, I may or may not use cross-hatching lines. For petals, I'm using the same lines. I'm doing all lines going in the same direction, but it's all dependent on the contours. So I might use some cross-hatching here and there for shadows that need more of an emphasis on darker areas. But generally speaking, I do the same line in the same direction, but it flows with the contours of what it is that I am shading. And that reduces this look of a flattened object, because if you were to just crosshatch and not curve the line in any way around the object itself, it tends to flatten it. Even though you're shading it, it tends to flatten it. But that does give a very cool textural graphic nature to artwork. It's just that for my style of work, I like having a rounded, soft appearance to my ink work. So what I do is, let's use the sphere example. If I were to shade a sphere, I'm going to create those lines as if they're wrapped around the sphere. I'm not just doing straight lines across it. So I'm taking this similar concept and essentially wrapping these lines around the contours of every single dip in these petals. I also do harder lines with more pressure, where there's going to be more of an intense shadow, especially if there's little dips in the petal ruffles where there's going to be a crisp edge. I will emphasize that using more pressure on the lines in that area. These lines and how I'm forming them towards the petals kind of resemble the texture that you would find on a petal. You can see little veins and little ruffles of texture as they go from the center of the flower and out towards the edge of the petal. It creates these little ripples of vertical lines going across the petal. And it's kind of similar to how I draw hair as well, specifically straight or smooth hair. Even individual curls, you use a similar concept where you put most of the pressure where it's being folded or where there's a shadow and flick it out and leave that highlighted area where the light source is hitting it blank. Alright, so right now I am looking at the last layer of the poppy flower I just painted previously, and I'm just making sure that it's matching in aesthetics, I guess. And I also like doing this thing with my ink work where I leave a thicker line outlining the whole object that I just got done drawing. I find that especially when I incorporate my ink work with gouache paintings, it just makes it pop and gives just a really cool effect. I'm a huge fan of contrast, so I think that's why I like doing this. When I do the outline of any objects I draw in ink with traditional media, I use a separate pen entirely for the outlines because I don't want that softer ballpoint look for the outline. I want more of an inkier outline, so I'll use a pen that's just generally more inky. You know what I mean? So for this pattern that I'm making, I intended on making an ornate looking floral pattern, and I had the idea of making something sort of in the shape of a triangle. So I wanted a flower that was just face on for the center, and that's what I'm doing here. I just started with a circle as the basic structure of the flower, and I divided that into sections so that I had the petals all separated out. I added the ruffle contours, and now I'm going in and manually shading that with my small brush. If you look at any flower, specifically poppy flowers, because that's what I'm drawing here, little areas where the petal flips up, because they're a very delicate flower, they kind of remind me of tissue paper. When they flip up, they have little bits of contrast of the shadow underneath, so I will highlight not highlight, I will darken right underneath where that ruffle comes up as it's coming towards the viewer, towards your eye. I will darken that underneath a little bit to give the idea that it's flipping up towards itself, just the tiniest bit. Any areas on the petals where there is a stronger ripple that is obscuring the petal a bit, like hiding part of the petal, like right here where I'm working on, I will make a longer line. So I won't do a short one like in this area where there's a subtle shadow underneath the center of the flower. Those lines are a lot shorter because it's just a subtle little dip in the petal, but areas where there's more of a fold of the petal on itself, I'll do a longer line and I will make it a little bit more dark with more pressure with my hand to give the idea that it's folded there. Now earlier I did mention cross-hatching, so a lot of these lines, as you can see, they don't go in a crisscross pattern as much. A lot of them are flowing towards the petal, they're going in the similar direction. However, in some cases I will do some cross-hatching where I make a line, a series of lines going opposite towards the lines that I have already established, and usually I will incorporate that type of cross-hatch shading in areas where there's like a really dark shadow, like where a petal is casting a shadow on another one. Like right here, for instance, you can see there's a really dark overlap with that petal going over the one underneath. And this just really, because sometimes if you're doing this technique, even when you do a really heavy hand, it doesn't give the idea as much that that's necessarily a shadow. So I do opposite flowing lines to really break up those lines and make it look different from everywhere else. That way it's more obvious as to what it is, that it is a shadow being cast. I also want to mention that poppy flowers, their petals are a little bit, not waxy, but they're kind of shiny in a way, and they give that look, that sort of glossy look, especially orange California poppies, the common poppy. They reflect light in that way that's a little bit glossier, and that's why I'm incorporating more of these short strokes that are shading the center of the flower and leaving that highlight completely blank. It just makes it look more glossy. And you can see in these photos, especially with direct sunlight, that they are really reflective and have that thin high beam of light just glossing over those petals at the high points. The center of the flower, I try not to put too much detail. They have this weird kind of tent looking center that points up. I try not to put too much detail there because they have these, I have no idea what the term is, but it looks like little black strands that come out from the centers. And I leave that area, you know, not as detailed because it's going to be obscured quite a bit from those little hairs. So for this portion of the drawing, I put down an equilateral triangle as a reference, and I put Procreate on the symmetry mode so that I didn't have to draw this twice or copy and paste it. It lets you draw on one side and it automatically draws the same thing that you're doing on the other side. Right here, I'm doing a lot of poppy buds and leaves, and I'm creating an elaborate ornate pattern to form the shape of this pattern. And I'm doing one corner of the triangle because I'm just doing this on symmetry mode, and then I'm going to copy and paste it and put it on every single point of that triangle to make sure that it's even. The triangle is there to make sure everything is exact and lined up perfectly in a triangular position. For the leaves, anytime there's going to be a stem, I leave that blank. I just leave the center stem of the leaf blank entirely, and then I start my shading outside of that, and that little gap just gives the illusion of a highlighted ridge right in the center. As a stylistic choice, I chose to keep all the shading in the center of the leaves, and as they fan out, I made it lighter. I thought that that looked the best in my opinion. I didn't try to get super realistic with it. I still tried keeping it true to how I would normally draw this on my illustration board paintings. I really like the look of that gradient effect across the leaves. For the poppy buds, I did a lot of circular shading, meaning I curved my lines for shading around that spherical shape. They're not straight lines, they're very curved. I also included little tiny hairs across the stems that they're attached to, and I didn't make the lines that are describing those tiny hairs actually attached to the stem. I left a little gap and just did little flicks of ink outwards around the stems, and that makes it look like little light tiny hairs that you would normally see on these flowers. With the triangle layer still on as reference, I arrange all of my layers together and create this pattern that I'm later going to turn into a repeat pattern. And then I get rid of the triangle. And that is it. That's it for this part of this triangle pattern creation. I hope this was helpful, and if you would like to see more videos, subscribe, give this a thumbs up, and I will see you next week. Bye!